Shalom and Chag Sameach. On behalf of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies, the College of Arts and Humanities, and the Gildenhorn and Dubin families, I want to welcome you to the 15th annual Dubin Family Lecture, the first and hopefully the last to be held completely online. I'm Professor Paul Sham, and I have the honor to be a director of the Gildenhorn Institute. First, I want to extend a particularly warm welcome to some of our distinguished guests, including President Darrell Pines, Vice President Brody Remington, Dean Bonnie Thornton Dill of the College of Arts and Humanities, the Gildenhorn and Dubin families, and notable members of our faculty. And it's required by law that I let you know this event is being recorded. As you know, our featured speaker today is David Sanger, currently White House correspondent of the New York Times. We are also honoring Professor Yoram Perry, my distinguished predecessor as a director of the Gildenhorn Institute, who will be retiring at the end of this academic year. Professor Perry joins us from Tel Aviv, where people are now celebrating Israel's Independence Day. And we send our best wishes and congratulations. After David Sanger speaks, he and Professor Perry will dialogue for 10 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. If you want to ask a question at any time, please type it into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Then our moderator, Professor Scott Lesensky, will see it and ask the panelists during the Q&A. And now I would like to introduce our benefactors. Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn and Alma Gildenhorn with Professor Yoram Perry.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everyone. In year 2006, Al and I were honored to establish the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies, an important program to study and explore Israel within the framework of today's world, its accomplishments and strategic importance in the Middle East. Our first priority was to select an outstanding director to implement that vision on the highest level of scholarship, experience, and leadership. In short, we were looking for a star. In 2009, our extensive search was completed. Dr. Yoram Perry, a renowned thought leader and activist on Israel matters, accepted the university's offer, and the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies was launched on a trajectory of excellence under his outstanding leadership. Yoram, who's on Israel, I wish that you and your lovely wife, Benita, were here in person to accept our warmest thanks and appreciation for all that you have done to propel the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland to the top echelon of Israel Studies program in America. Thank you for your efforts.
Hi, Ram, and welcome from your friends at the University of Maryland to you in Tel Aviv, Israel. This is, I know it's the end of your day, and we're just ending our early evening on a very happy note, and that's to tell you that this is our night to honor you and to celebrate all your accomplishments as director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies from 2009 to 2020. We knew from your resume that you were no novice. Your past was prologue to an exciting new beginning for Israel Studies at Maryland. Allow me, my friends, to share some highlights of your brilliant and multifaceted career prior to your coming to Maryland. Yoram Perry was born in Jerusalem. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in political science and sociology from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and his PhD was earned at the London School of Economics. In the years that followed, some professional credits include political advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister Golda Meir's spokesperson for the Labor Party and her emissary to Europe, editor in chief of the Israeli daily newspaper Davar, radio host, journalist, and commentator, author of critically acclaimed and award winning books, visiting professorships at Harvard and Dartmouth, fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and a Fulbright scholar at American University right here in Washington. As you can imagine, his fame preceded him, and his classes were overscribed from day one. In a short period of time, the Institute went from teaching 2 to 3 classes per semester to 7 and 8, a huge vote of acclamation from the students. Faculty and curriculum were expanded, and leading Israeli scholars intensified the learning experience for our nearly 600 undergraduate students. Graduate courses were offered, and advanced research successfully evolved. Israel Studies became an independent and integral part of the College of Arts and Humanities Middle East Studies program. Frank and critical discussions and constructive dialogue ensued, opening doors of understanding. The engine that helped fuel the success of our institute was Professor Perry's additional position as editor in chief of the Israel Studies Review, the premier academic journal of the Association of Israel Studies, together with our present director, President Professor Paul Sham. They set the standard of excellence that characterizes our mission. The articles published, the result of serious inquiry and research, informed and enriched our program here at Maryland and made a huge impact on the study of Israel today. Professor Perry holds the coveted Abraham and Jack Hay Chair in Israel Studies. One of Professor Perry's favorite public programs is the Dubin Family Lecture, funded by Elizabeth Dubin and her late husband, Richard Dubin. We thank Liz and her family for their generous support. Now, in its 15th year, it has become a tradition at Maryland. Tonight, David Sanger, the Pulitzer Prize winning author and New York Times journalist, will take his place in our pantheon of distinguished guest speakers. We dedicate this program to you, Yoram, with our gratitude and deepest respect. We thank you, Yoram, for being our fearless leader and wish you and Penina a strong Turk shalom.
Thank you.
Thanks for everything. I now have the great honor of welcoming the 34th president of the University of Maryland, Dr. Darrell Pines. Next week, we will celebrate his investiture with ceremonies and programs to officially inaugurate his tenure. President Pines, your being with us tonight is our official warm welcome to you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Darrell Pines. Thank you. Good evening, Darrell.
Good evening, Alma, and thank you so much for that warm introduction. I also want to praise Dr. Perry for his leadership. Unfortunately, I won't have a chance to overlap with him, but thank you for your incredible service of the Gildenhorn Institute on Israeli Studies. Of course, a special thank you to Alma Gildenhorn for her introduction of me. Alma, I can't wait until I can visit with you in person again, back on our beloved campus. I want to take this opportunity to also formally thank you for hosting my wife, Sylvia, and I at your home with you and Joe. It was a wonderful night and last week, and I'm very grateful. It's, of course, wonderful to have both of you here tonight virtually. We truly appreciate your leadership, and you are such valuable assets to the University of Maryland community. I also want to thank Liz Dubin and her family for their support and involvement in making this event possible. Thank you so much. I'm happy to have the Israel Studies program on our campus because the presence of this vibrant program promotes open and balanced dialogue on nuanced and complicated issues. As you know, I am a firm believer of engaging communities on their passions and discussing grand challenges openly with subject matter experts. That's why I taught a course on the grand challenges of our times, and then I invited leaders in their field to discuss their passions with me. I met with Dr. Mona Hana Atisha, the physician, scientist, and public health activist who shined a national spotlight on the Flint, Michigan water crisis. I also met with Reginald Dwayne Betts, a 2009 graduate, a critically acclaimed writer, public speaker, and advocate for incarcerated people. I also met with Dr. Stephanie Evergreen, an internationally recognized speaker, designer, and researcher best known for bringing a research-based approach to helping people better communicate their work through more effective graphs, slides, and reports. I realize finding answers to grand challenges takes time because there are no easy solutions. But through discussions like these that we're about to have, we are urgently reminded that we're all very globally connected. Having a vibrant presence is just one of the strengths of the Israel Studies program. The Israel Studies program has grown to the country's largest, most dynamic program with more than 500 students taking 15 different courses and stands as a cornerstone of the university's specialization in the Middle East, complementing the Roshan Institute for Persian Studies, the Arabic and Hebrew language programs, and the work of Professor Shibli Telhami, who is the Anwar Sadat Chair of Peace and Development. The Israel Studies program also offers students, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, a chance to wrestle with complex issues facing the Middle East, preparing our students for life in a globally connected world and careers in today's international economy. Throughout the pandemic, the Institute has continued to serve as the editorial home of the Journal of Israel Studies, as well as lending a balanced academic voice to the policy debates surrounding Israel and its neighbors. With the added stressors of COVID-19 pandemic. We must continue to navigate, envision, and work together to create the world that we want to live in. One where we recognize our shared humanity, and one where we are motivated to tackle the most pressing issues of our time. I want to thank all of you for your work to help grow and support the Israel Studies program. Not only are your efforts helping to change our community, but they are helping to shape our world. And now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Mr. David Sanger. David Sanger is a White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times and a senior writer. In a 38-year reporting career at the Times, he has been on the 3 teams that have won Pulitzer Prizes, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. His newest book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, and an HBO documentary by the same title, examine the emergence of cyber conflict and its role in changing the nature of global power. Mr. Sanger is also an adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School of Government, where he co-teaches Central Challenges in American National Security, Strategy, and the Press. Please join me in welcoming Mr. David Sanger.
Well, thank you very much, President Pines. And I want to thank all of you for inviting me to conduct this 15th Dubin lecture. We hoped, of course, initially to do this last year in person, and that was just as the pandemic was beginning. And then we were certain, of course, we'd be able to do it in person this year. And here we are once again in virtual suspended animation. But I'm pleased anyway to be back at College Park, a place I've spoken at frequently, met many of the students, and have always been impressed with. And I want to thank you, Dr. Pines, and wish you the best as you take on this new job, and to do it in the midst of challenges like a pandemic is pretty unimaginable. I'd like to thank the Dubin family, Elizabeth Dubin and the rest of the family, for sponsoring this conversation, and particularly like to thank my old friends Alma and Joe Gilderhorn. From the time that Joe was ambassador to Switzerland, to their work here in Washington, to the Wilson Center, where I wrote 2 of my 3 books, to their work at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown, they always bring light and understanding wherever they've gone. They've been champions of good scholarship and of good journalism, even if the news we're reporting is at times unwelcome. And they understand the need for active debate, as do all of you at the Israel Center. And so I thank you for having me here. Let me turn to today's talk, and I look forward to the conversation that will follow, starting with our honoree, Professor Urim Perry, and congratulations on your retirement, and then with all of you. I thought the best place to begin might be with an event that took place last weekend that I think helps us unspool the nature of the current relationship between the Netanyahu government in Israel and the new administration of Joe Biden. On Sunday, a huge explosion rocked the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant in Iran. Natanz, of course, is well known to many of you. It's the centerpiece of Iran's nuclear production facilities. It's where they enrich uranium. It's a program the Iranians insist is for peaceful purposes only, and that almost everyone in the West, and certainly all Western intelligence agencies, believe is providing the fuel for a potential bomb project in Iran. It's also the site of where the United States and Israel worked together to design the most sophisticated cyber attack in history more than a decade ago. It was codenamed Operation Olympic Games. Many of you knew of it as the Stuxnet attack. But the thing to know is, first, that it was the most sophisticated cyber operation we've ever seen against an industrial plant that previously you could only stop but with an act of physical sabotage or sending in bombers. But Olympic Games was notable for something else. It was truly a joint operation between the National Security Agency, not far from the College Park campus, and Israel's Unit 8200, its quite secret cyber unit. They worked together for years to develop the code that would get inside the plant, speed up those centrifuges, these giant silvery machines that you've seen pictures of that spin at supersonic speeds, change the code that guides them, speed them up, slow them down until they blew up. And that helped force Iran into the negotiations in 2015 that ultimately led to the Iran nuclear deal with the United States and, of course, with many of our allies and other partners. It also became a symbol of the closeness that Israel and the United States have in dealing with the Iran problem. In fact, there's a small club of people who were involved in the operation who now have tucked away in their offices or their wine cellars some Israeli created wine, bottled and with a label that has the 5 circles of the Olympics on it, a silent tribute for the code name Olympic Games, which I should note had absolutely nothing to do with the Olympics. Speed forward to this Sunday. This attack was not a joint operation. It came in the middle of President Biden's effort to restart negotiations with Iran and revive the Iran nuclear deal that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made no secret that he opposes. Yes, the attack seemed certainly intent on slowing down Iran's progress. They had just the day before had Iran Nuclear Day and celebrated the return of many of their nuclear operations. But it also appeared to be directed at Mr. Biden's diplomacy. And it seemed that there was an expectation in Israel, though no one in Israel has quite said so, that it would have the double benefit of blowing up the centrifuges and blowing up these negotiations. Now, we know it blew up some centrifuges. We don't know yet whether it actually destroyed the negotiations. Those are supposed to resume on Thursday. This will be, whether it works or not, a very lengthy, difficult set of talks. But the interaction between Israel and the Biden administration on this speaks volumes. The administration came out shortly after the explosion and said, we are not involved, something they never said after Olympic Games a decade ago. They refused to answer the question of whether or not they had been given an early heads up that Israel was going to go do this. Although I'm told that they were given a little bit of advance notice, but not so much that they could have actually blocked the Israelis from going ahead with the operation. Suddenly, we have seen a world in which Israel and the United States share a common goal, that is preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, but have radically different strategies to get there. President Biden says the only solution is a diplomatic one. Nothing else will be lasting. Prime Minister Netanyahu says, no, in fact, what we need to do is mow the lawn, constantly push back on the Iranian program because they could never be trusted in a real negotiation, and that the documents that Israel stole from Iran 3 years ago from a warehouse in Tehran prove that the Iranians lied all along and were working on a weapon. Whether they still are is still an open question, although it's worth noting that the Worldwide Threat Initiative that was brought out by the Biden administration just yesterday, first time it's been published in 2 years since the Trump administration did not publish it in its last year in office, says explicitly that they don't see any evidence that Iran is right now working on the design of a device. That may mean they have one already, but it may also mean that Biden's got some time to let this work out. These radically different visions between an Israel that believes the only way to stop the program is to attack it, and an American administration that believes the only way to stop the program is to reach a durable agreement with the Israelis to prevent it from happening, seem to encapsulate the state of the relationship now. It also tells you something about change priorities. The US-Israel relationship used to run through the Palestinian issue. That was the constant source of discussion at forums in the United States on the Mideast or in Israel about the future of both the country and its relationship with the US. The Palestinian issue remains centrally important to everyone these days. But it seems fair to say that the Biden administration does not see a huge amount of gain right now, especially when they are negotiating with a weakened Prime Minister Netanyahu. He may well manage to go form a government in the next few weeks. But let's face it, we've been through several dissolutions of the parliament, a bunch of new elections. Every time Netanyahu seems to eke it out with just a narrow plurality and needs to bolster his administration with some of the more right-wing parties. It's a difficult time for the United States to be dealing with an embattled Netanyahu, who's also facing at this point a very serious criminal charge in court. But it's not just Israel that can be difficult to work with right now. The United States isn't exactly in a super empowered position itself. We've had 4 years of turning deeply inward. Israel and Russia were the only two countries that seemed to escape Donald Trump's wrath, maybe Saudi Arabia. I think that the January 6th attack on the Capitol has called into question among many of our allies whether the United States is just too divided right now to get anything done. And more importantly, too divided to defend their allies in the Middle East. They take a look at what is going on in the US, and while they appreciate Mr. Biden's turn toward competitiveness, toward China, toward addressing inequalities in the United States, addressing significant racial issues in the United States, of course, the first fear of any ally is, but what about us? Why aren't we the number one priority? And I think that's particularly true right now in the Middle East, as people look at Biden's description of how he has to reorient the United States toward competitiveness with China. He said as much earlier today when he made his announcement that the US, after 20 years, would be getting out of Afghanistan. He said, we simply have other bigger challenges to go face today. So that takes us to the big issues with Israel. We know, of course, that Biden and Netanyahu have differed on the issue of settlements. You'll remember the time in 2010 when then Vice President Biden arrived in Israel just as some new settlements were being announced. And it led to a pretty tense encounter with Israeli government officials. Mr. Biden, as I said before, believes the only permanent way to halt the Iranian nuclear program is through diplomatic engagement. And that begins with restoring the status quo of the old agreement, the agreement that Mr. Netanyahu came to Washington to lobby against and spoke about in Congress. It also looks like the Israelis, are incredibly concerned that Mr. Biden will restore that agreement and then fail to be able to take the next big step, the step of making it longer and stronger. The Israelis have a good point, as do other critics of the administration, that the flaw in the agreement is that after 2030, it lifts all constraints on the Iranians on the production of nuclear material. Now, they still couldn't build a bomb, at least not legally. They are members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But it is definitely true that right now, if they just restored the agreement, you'd be getting an accord that was good for exactly 9 years. And that may not be long enough to accomplish the strategic goals we have in mind. And so you have now seen a concerted effort by the United States, and more notably by Israel, to set the program back. In January of 2020, of course, on President Trump's orders, General Soleimani was killed in Iraq. Then in this past summer, we saw an attack on Iran's central research laboratory at Natanz, where they build advanced centrifuges, an explosion and a fire. It was meant to rattle the Iranians, because when you have an explosion and a fire like that, it means there are insiders in your system, traitors who are willing to go turn around and blow up the facilities. And after the Iranians called for a crackdown, what happened? Well, the chief scientist who has designed many of the weapons side of the Iranian nuclear program, at least if you believe those documents stolen by Israel from Tehran, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated using a remote control gun this fall. And then, of course, last weekend, proving once again they have access, somebody gets deep inside the Natanz plant and manages, we think, at least based on current evidence, to plant enough explosives to take out the power supply, and that in turn would take out the centrifuges. One of the big questions here is that if this is Israel, and the Israeli press has said outright that it was, getting that easily past censors, then the issue becomes, what is it that they think that they will accomplish here? Will they succeed in putting together a program to constantly set back the Iranians? Or will the Iranians simply take their program and go deep underground? And if they do so, if they do take the program underground, has the short-term gain that we've gotten from these attacks on the plants actually turned into a long-range deficit? We have a lot of areas where we can collaborate between Israel and the United States in the next few years. The Iron Dome program, which the United States has contributed to Israel to help its defense from short-range rockets heading into the country, has proven an enormous success. The Abraham Accords, which President Biden has embraced, were a very constructive contribution from President Trump to get 2 more Arab states to basically recognize Israel, and that's something to build upon. We have extremely close counterterrorism operations. And we continue to have close cyber operations, particularly directed at Iran's own cyber core. But clearly what happened this past Sunday reveals a bigger discord, a fundamental mistrust that Israel can place its security in the hands of the Biden administration, and a fundamental distrust by Mr. Biden that Israel is willing to allow the United States to use its broad influence around the world and its power to accomplish the goal of negotiating an end to the Iranian program instead of leading to another bombing run. All of that takes trust. It means the US and Israel have to rebuild trust that has been eroded by this American conviction that Israel is going its own way and that it's so wrapped up in its own internal politics that it can't focus on the alliance the way strong Israeli governments did before. On the Israeli side, there's a fear that the United States underestimates the Iranian threat and that it is too subject to coercion. If you ask Israeli friends, they will tell you that there are always underway secret Iranian programs and that those would be unaffected. And we're not sure if they would be or they wouldn't be. And I think it's fair to say that there is a concern inside Israel that Iran is a more natural partner with the United States than, say, Saudi Arabia. And that dates back to the days of the Shah and before that. One last word about how this conflict between Israel, Iran, and the United States is likely to play out in the next few years. Yes, we all have to be worried about nuclear weapons. No one's more worried about them than I am. I've been covering nuclear developments for the New York Times for more than 3 decades, back to the first stories about North Korea's program. But at the same time, the cyber attacks that we have seen so far coming out of Iran and out of most other states are fairly well directed. They are narrow. They're aimed at specific facilities like Natanz. And that means that so far there has been a fair bit of restraint. I fear that day is ending. That an Iranian government that recognizes what would happen to it if it ever used a nuclear weapon will turn instead to its extremely potent and very talented cyber corps. Because you can launch a cyber attack on the United States or one of its allies from Iranian territory with a few stops elsewhere without ever having to get physically inside the country. And I think the Iranians have recognized that this is a useful tool against any country like Israel, like the United States, that is highly wired. So while it's in our nature, given our experience, to think about the Six-Day War, the other wars of the United States that have taken place, I think it's worth considering, are we prepared for low-level persistent cyber conflict with the likes of Iran and North Korea and China and Russia? And will this be the new way that Iran seeks to create some pressure? I would argue that that's almost certainly the case about what will happen in coming times. And I'd be happy to discuss that in more detail when we have our conversation. But I certainly wanted to leave plenty of time for that conversation. And so I will leave it there. I'm happy to take up other topics in the relationship, or since I'm here, the perpetual questions I get about why we do the things we do at the New York Times, which always makes some group of readers unhappy, sometimes multiple groups of readers unhappy about the same story. Never more so than when you're writing about Israel. So I thank you for having me. I look forward to our conversation, and we'll be starting right up with you, Yor.
Thank you very much, David, for your excellent presentation. When we thought 2 years ago to invite you, I was sure that it would be fascinating, and we were not mistaken. It was really very deep and and full of information and excellent analysis. And I do have many questions to ask you and comments, but before that, I have to thank all of those who spoke so nicely about me. I'm not used to it. And some of them are people who are newcomers, like our new president at the university. Others are worked with us for the last 10 years or so. So let me just go through some names: Paul Shem and Avis Koinman and Jacqueline Hopkins from our institute, Chaim Lepin from the Jewish Studies program, Greg Schaefer, Scott Lasensky, Nikki Everett, and others from other dean's office, etc. They worked with me for the last 10 years, or some of them more than that, and I really enjoy their partnership and their cooperation. And they enabled me to get the GIIS to where it is. Of course, I have to thank very much, special thanks for the President Pine, who is a newcomer to our field, but I'm sure that he will be very involved in the future, like his former presidents, to Dean Bonnie Dill, who was always cooperative, to Liz Dubin and her family, and above everybody else, to Alma and Joe Gildenhorn and their families. Without them, the Institute wouldn't have been established and the achievements of the Institute could have been reached. So thank you for all of you. We did choose a topic that cannot be less topical than the topic of the relations between Israel and the United States, which are, I'm afraid, in a critical moment. I look at it in a more serious way that you presented, David. After 4 years of full partnership, full cooperation, not few, and I'm one of them, believe that this cooperation hurt Israel's long-term interest more than supported it. Now there is a question mark about the future of this relationship. In spite of the fact that the two partners are very close and have common interests and common perception about the world and values, etc., I can see in the Israeli media already a lot of criticism about Biden. To argue that he is naive is the most simplistic one and more positive one. Others are much more dramatic, which reminds me when Henry Kissinger visited Israel the first time, he was encountered by Israeli demonstrators who called him a Jew boy. So no one will say that Biden is a Jew boy, but they do criticize him a lot. And I'll give you just one issue that was raised lately. Towards the end of this year, a conference organized by the UN is going to discuss the establishment of a nuclear demilitarized zone in the Middle East. And some experts in Israel thought that Mr. Biden will use these negotiations to put pressure on Israel. In the first meeting in 2019, Israel and the United States did not participate. Will the United States participate this time towards the end of the year? What will be the American position on that issue of nuclear demilitarization of the Middle East? So this is one question that I would put to you to answer later. The other thing is that you mentioned Iran and the Palestinians, but there's a third element which is very important, and that is the Hezbollah. The latest analysis of the Israeli intelligence, military intelligence, said that they are worried that the Hezbollah will increase its violence against Israel because of the changing policies within the United States. President Trump used policies of maximum pressure, and that was the reason that the Hezbollah were very careful not to react. But now, with the new soft peacenik the new president, the Hezbollah might be more willing to show their power, particularly that the new representative of the closest advisor to the president is Robert Malley, who used to spend some years in the International Crisis Group. And he believes that the French initiative to strengthen the government in Beirut is the positive way to solve the issues, the problems of Lebanon. And that should include giving a position and a role to the Hezbollah, something that the Israelis are very worried about. So there are several issues, not only the nuclear issue in Iran, but the Hezbollah, the nuclear issue in general, the relations between the changing attitudes, the changing American attitudes towards Saudi Arabia. The question is whether these changes of attitude will not weaken the process that began 2-3 years ago of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But let me start really with one question that many Israelis are talking about in the last 2 days. When they analyze the developments, there is a fear, and I'm using carefully that word, a fear that a new war is in the horizon, not just an indirect war using indirect means that you are an expert on, but the escalation might lead to much more serious clash. So let's start with that. Do you think that there is an option to such an escalation or deterioration that will lead to direct confrontation between the two states?
David, this is Scott Lesensky. Thank you, Yorm. I'm just going to interject briefly. Our time is limited. The questions are exploding. Perhaps poor choice of metaphor. So feel free to answer those initial questions from Yorm as briefly as you'd like, and we'll bring in the audience who are eager to share some thoughts.
Very good. I'd be glad to do it. I think it's a little bit early to judge where Joe Biden is going to come out. But the history of, Biden is probably one of the best known political figures in the United States over the past 30 years. He ran the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The group of people he surrounded himself with as his top foreign policy advisors, from Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, to the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, to the new Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, have dealt with Israel for years. So this concept that you read in some of the Israeli press that somehow this is a new naive group that's come along that will be led around, I think is a little bit simplistic. Second, it's no secret that Prime Minister Netanyahu did not care for President Obama, and they had pretty tense relations along the way. But I think the bigger shock that you're seeing right now is that for 4 years during the Trump administration, there was a president who never pushed back on any Israeli policy, whether it dealt with the Palestinians or involved trying to choke off Iran. And it's not clear to many in Washington right now that those Trump-era policies actually worked. It was President Trump who said that maximum pressure on Iran would break Iran, force it to come to the negotiating table and make a deal, and that's why he got out of the Iran nuclear deal. Well, that was 2018. We've been 3 years of sanctions, of what the Trump administration called maximum pressure, and the Iranians did not come back to a deal. I think that there are some significant flaws in the Iran nuclear deal. I think everybody understands that the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah has got to get broken if you're going to have peace and security. I think it's pretty clear that Iran's support for the Syrian leader is going to have to be effective. The question is, do you believe that the continued pressure of the past 4 years, which didn't really seem to go solve that problem, would work going forward? And the only thing I would say to your good points here is, we're not 100 days into this administration. Several key members of the foreign policy team, including Deputy Secretary Sherman, didn't get confirmed until a few hours before we joined today. So I think I'd give them a little time.
Thank you. If I could, can I start a round? I'll do a quick round. Yoram, and you should also jump in. Questions are for both of you. Our time is short. I will steal 10 seconds though and add, everyone has spoken, Yoram, about your relevance, your brilliance, your productivity. I just want to add from a colleague and someone who you've mentored, you practice something that's not always easy to find in this world, the spirit of derech eretz, and you know what I mean, how you treat others. And Phil Brenner and some others are sending in messages. We all will miss your presence and your engagement. Treat this as a cafeteria style. A few questions that have come in. A few about what you just said, David, so I'll leave those aside, about flaws of the deal. What about Hezbollah? What about missile program? What about Iran's malign behavior? I think you addressed that. I'll give you 3 others and sort of pick which ones you want to look at. One, Abe Foxman asked a question, how can you overcome the distrust that you talked about earlier if the US-Israel relationship is increasingly politicized in the polarized setting of American politics? How can the Israel relationship and the alliance be insulated? A separate question on a slightly different vein, are there differences of policy or is there a difference of culture? You mentioned mowing the lawn. Are we just stuck in a reality where Israelis think a problem like this can be managed and Americans come with their attitude, every problem has a solution? And I'll slip in one more, pick what you want and we'll do a second round when you're ready. Ari Kruglansky asked, given how you ended, David, would you predict that maybe cyber ultimately is going to eclipse the nuclear issue?
So 3 great questions. So to my friend Abe Foxman, it's good to hear from him again. Trust is going to be the hardest thing to put together. And I'm not sure right now how much the Biden administration thinks it's going to invest in Prime Minister Netanyahu. He may manage to put a government together here, but he's clearly, if he does, he's been through election after election where he's sort of just barely held on. And I think they view him as basically running toward the end of his time. And so I think that the big question in my mind is, how much will they spend the time and the energy, especially at a moment when the president is focusing on China, big strategic issues, which he even cited in his speech today about why we needed to get out of Afghanistan. I'm sorry, the second question, if you can just remind me briefly, was
mowing the lawn. Is this a difference of policy,
right,
or fundamental difference of political culture?
It is both, right? I think the culture in Israel has always been that you do a preemptive strike in order to both solve a problem, set a program back, and send a message. That's what happened to the Iraqi nuclear program. That's what happened in the Israeli strike against Syria's nuclear program, which was being supported by North Korea. And now that's what's happened with the Iranian nuclear program. The US is not averse to doing that. Olympic Games, which I cited there at the beginning, was in fact a sort of US inspired, though jointly designed program. There are many in Israel who dispute that and say the first idea was with them. But the fact of the matter is the US has been perfectly willing to sabotage Iranian nuclear sites as they have North Korean missile programs and so forth. And we've written about those at length. I think, though, that the difference in culture is that Biden doesn't believe any of those things are a solution. They think they are useful in driving the Iranians to a diplomatic negotiation, whereas Israel's approach is, we'll do it this week, and if we need to do it again next month, we'll do it again next month. Now, is this sort of usual American optimism that you can negotiate anything? Maybe so, but who knows? And on cyber, there's a lot to be said on this, and maybe sometime I'll come back and talk about cyber alone. But the bottom line is this. You can't think of cyber as a separate weapon, that there are little cyber wars going on and then there's everything else. Cyber has become the central way that countries compete and undercut each other. That's true for Iran, which knows what would happen to it if it ever used a nuclear weapon or even a large conventional weapon, but has had great success in using its cyber weapons against Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco, in the United States, against banks, against the Sands Casino. They see it as a way to conduct a constant short of war operations. And if you look at what happened to the United States in the past 3 months with the Solar Winds attack from Russia and then the Hafnium attack from China, what we're seeing is a vastly increased pace at which cyber is becoming the primary battlefield between the US and its allies and many adversaries.
It's terrific. Can I pepper you with a couple of more?
Sure.
There's like streaming in. Professor Herf, Jeffrey Herf here at the University of Maryland, asked simply, if the Iranians dig in, will it ultimately just bind Israel and the United States and the Europeans together? And might we expect it? Dan Alpert, who not only is a student of the Gildenhorn Institute, but also University of Maryland's current president of the student government. Dan asked a question about the Abraham Accords. How will they impact the dynamics that you laid out? It got us out of the annexation quandary last year. Could these Israel-Persian Gulf ties and could the Abraham Accords, some call them the normalization agreements, could they somehow get us out of this brewing confrontation between Israel, Iran, and the US? Maybe I'll just leave you those two, and
Sure.
if there's time.
So
we'll
the
do a final round.
Iranians digging in is a big concern because, as always in proliferation issues, the big worry is what happens if you can hide something where we don't see it. And that's why the US wants to make sure that we continue to have a lot of inspectors going in and out of the country. We continue a lot of national technical means. Clearly, Israel has penetrated their program very thoroughly. But digging in is an issue. Could it bind together the Europeans, the United States, and maybe even Israel? Well, it did 10 years ago, right? When there was significant contributions, not just from the US and Israel, but from European intelligence agencies in sabotaging the Iranian program in Olympic Games, as I described. But I think there are limits to that. And I think that there is a sense in the United States that once President Trump pulled out of the 2018 agreement, the Iranians stopping over time their own compliance was inevitable. I think the Iranians have done this in a fairly careful way. They've made it clear that almost everything they've done is reversible. They have not so far announced that they're cutting off these negotiations after the bombing or after the explosion over the weekend. They have announced they're going to move to 60% enrichment, which is just short of bomb grade. So they're doing whatever they can to try to put pressure on the US to act. But they haven't been racing for a bomb in a way that we've seen it, at least according to the latest worldwide threat assessment, which came out yesterday. To the very good question on the Abraham Accords, these accords may end up being the most useful thing that the Trump administration left us in the Middle East, because they do give something to build on. They do result in the recognition of Israel by two Arab nations that couldn't have thought of doing that after the accords with Egypt. They could form a solution in the Persian Gulf, but they may also make Iran feel all the more isolated, that they are in conflict with the US, with the Saudis, with the Israelis. And so it's got to be relatively carefully managed.
Yoram?
No, I want to conclude. Don't we have to conclude?
Well, it's going so well, but we have reached the time. Before we conclude, I'm just gonna hijack the last 30 seconds before turning it back to you, Yoram, because some of the comments in the Q&A are not questions on policy and high politics for David and you, they're students. And I'll just read one if you don't mind, and then turn it over to you to conclude. From Amna Faruqi, who was one of your students some years ago. I met her also. She was an intern at the White House. I'll just read. Tonight, I'm reminded how much I missed the Dubin. Sorry, this isn't a question. I'm enjoying the conversation, but this is a comment. Professor Perry was one of the most important professors I had during my time at UMD, especially the courses I had in the Gildenhorn Institute. It's hard to put into words just how much his teaching has shaped me and how much I owe him for challenging me to be a sharp, analytical, rigorous thinker about politics, society, and justice. I'm currently an organizer in rural Georgia, but I still use the lessons that I learned in his classes. So thank you from Amna and from so many of your students. Thank you, David. I'll let you close the event, Yoram.
Very nice. I'm flattered with all these wonderful words about me. And I thank all of you for doing that. I also thank David for his excellent conversation. But let me finish with something else. And that is that since we established the GIIS, we made an effort, and I think that we were successful in that, to prove that this topic of Israel can be studied at university as an academic discipline, like any other academic discipline. So we taught the history of Zionism, we taught about the Israeli political structure, about Israeli society, about Israeli culture, and even the Middle East, Israeli Arab, Israeli Palestinian conflict. In the last several years, that became much more difficult. And the fact that the prolonged conflict between Israel and the Palestinians had made the topic, and the topic of Israel in general, much more politicized. In the United States, the criticism of Israel became more severe, and you can see that in many more campuses at the academic world. And unfortunately, the Israeli government's policies are giving excellent excuses for critics of Israel to pursue their initiatives. I'm afraid we don't know what will happen in the near future, because one of the most important things is what will be the outcome of the coalition building, and which might lead us to either to a center-right coalition, or maybe even to a much worse coalition from my point of view, because it will be based on extreme militant conservatives, illiberal hawks, which will pursue policies that will escalate the conflict, not only between Israel and its neighbors, Israel and Europe, but also between Israel and the liberal forces in the United States. So I hope that the people who are going to replace me and the people who are going to work in the next few years at the Gildenhorn Institute will be able to pursue the tradition that we have established to teach, research, discuss Israel issues in an academic, you cannot say objective, but at least in an academic fair way. But I'm not sure that time will be better in the near few years than it was when I started more than 10 years ago. So again, I thank you all. Again, I thank you, David, the participants, the panelists, the contributors, the friends of the Gildenhorn Institute, and I wish you a very happy Independence Day tomorrow. Thank you.